Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Here we go again. We're told the Islamic State terrorist group is the worst of the worst and has global ambitions. The public is being taught slowly but surely to fear the Islamic State. It would appear Washington continues to attempt to shape and reshape the Middle East. To crosstalk the Islamic State, I'm joined by my guest, Jabir Hassan, in London. He is director of the Iraqi Association. Also in London, we have Joseph Willits. He is from the Council for Arab-British Understanding. And in Washington, we cross to Ray Locker. He is the Washington Enterprise editor for USA Today. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want. Ray, if I can go to you in Washington, we have the U.S. Defense Secretary saying the Islamic State threat beyond anything we've seen. Is it really of this magnitude here? Because we've heard this before about other groups and the march to war. Go ahead, Ray in Washington.
Well, we have a history of doing that. I mean, the government does. We saw that pre-2003 with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, saying he had weapons of mass destruction. He didn't. We invaded anyway, and now the rest of the world wonders about our credibility. However, we had an attack on 9/11 13 years ago that killed more than 3,000 people, and nobody wants to be the person in charge in the government who turns a blind eye to something like that, rules out a potential threat, and then comes to regret it later. So certainly politically, the pressure is on to always take these things seriously, and then if they turn out not to be so bad, to dial it back. This may not be a case where we can dial it back if we keep stepping up the military action.
Okay, that's interesting. Joseph, if I can go to you in London, but I mean, I suppose if you could just, the chicken or the egg here. Of course, no politician wants to be held responsible for not being vigilant enough here. But if you continue to involve yourself in the affairs of other people very far away, at Syria, the Free Syrian Army, give them money, give them equipment. Oh, well, they're too religious or too radical for us, so they move over to another group with our equipment, our money, our training. And, again, the law of unintended consequences. I mean, of course, what Ray says is true, but that also can justify more military intervention when less intervention is probably the best thing to do. Go ahead. Joseph in London.
Well, I think bombing alone would not be the right idea for Syria or for Iraq. There obviously needs to be a very clear strategy, which there hasn't been for a long, long time in Syria and for the wider region. We have, we've also getting the argument now that somehow, ISIS is the new evil, and there has been failures, countless failures in terms of dealing with Assad. And let us not forget that, Assad is still barrel bombing people in Aleppo. There are still atrocities carrying out, documented evidence of war crimes on both sides. Obviously, the fear of ISIS is great, and I think the turning point happens to be, I think, the beheading of James Foley a couple of days ago, and it seems that now, the death of an American journalist is bringing this back into the spotlight and bringing it closer to home again.
Joseph, let me ask you: do you think that's done intentionally? And I'm not dismissing the suffering of that man and his family and his grieving family, but it's quite interesting from a PR perspective, isn't it, to have such a spotlight on an American being killed by someone with a British accent, which I think needs to be a little bit more investigated as well. What I'm just saying is it fits really well into this kind of media environment.
Well, I think with the images of James Foley, we have possibly the biggest extremist PR coup since 9/11. I think there's comparable images in terms of London's bombings and Madrid bombings, and also the death of Lee Rigby, the soldier on the streets of London last year. And I think the argument is that there's a sense that however horrific and gory and extreme the decapitation of James Foley is, it seems strange that only now we are recognising the plight of Iraqis and Syrians who are suffering similar fates at the hands of ISIS. And there is a risk, a very serious risk, that you're sending a message that one American life is more valuable than countless thousands of Iraqi and Syrian ones.
Okay, Jabir, in London, one of the interesting things is if we look at this ongoing tragedy in Syria, where no one is faultless, wouldn't it be time, logically speaking, to make amends with Assad and take on, according to the U.S. Defense Department, the most horrific threat to the world and take on ISIS together? That would be logical, but it's not going to happen, is it?
Well, I don't think so. To be practical on this issue, especially on the reality, proved that there is no way for the Western allies to make any peace or deals with the Assad regime. But the threat is there, and ISIS is growing, and there should be an immediate action to halt their advances on both sides of the border, Iraq and Syria.
Okay, Ray, it seems to me this is exactly what ISIS wants. They want to take on the big Western military giant. They want to take them, and they're just waiting for it because this is what feeds up, attracts a lot of people to their followings. I mean, the FBI, and we have other Western intelligence agency having a difficult time estimating how many Westerners are actually joining ISIS right now. I mean, this is really quite interesting here. This is what ISIS wants. It's in the spotlight. It's all about they're the purest, the baddest, the meanest, all of the above. Wouldn't it be better not to play their game and to back off and see where it's going to go?
I don't think it's best to back off. I mean, I think you do that at your own risk. I mean, clearly this is an unstable group has a very apocalyptic worldview, and to let them do whatever they want would be a mistake, regardless of where you are. I mean, there are so many dangers, in any of these decisions, and I don't think you see the U.S. government rushing to do anything. President Obama does not want to go into Syria. He only wants to deal with that if he absolutely has to, because the choices are all bad. You go in, you take out the Islamic State in Syria, you're helping Assad, or you may be helping another group. But, I mean, what are your choices?
Well, okay, maybe the choices is just too much intervention. Too much intervention here. Joseph, Ray is absolutely right, because whatever party you help, you're going to help another party that you don't like. That's a terrible foreign policy position to be in. And, we've seen this tumultuous change in that region since the end of the Cold War, particularly in this century here. It's outside meddling. The more outside meddling, the more situations come up like this.
Well, clearly there has been a failed strategy when it comes to Syria and Iraq, and again, it seems that we're only talking about this now. But we can neither diminish or stray away from the threat of ISIS, and we cannot stray away from the threat of Assad. I keep reiterating this point. That only last year we were talking about chemical attacks in Ghouta. We're talking about barrel bombs in Aleppo. We're talking about evidence of 11,000 people killed under Assad, and evidence of photographic evidence of torture. And of course, we're seeing evidence of ISIS atrocities. We're seeing crucifixions, we're seeing beheadings, we're seeing amputations, we're seeing this policy of fear. And of course, when we're talking about the issue of James Foley, this image of an American being beheaded in such a way is not necessarily a new one. It's a tried and tested method that Al-Qaeda have used, and there is a discussion now about whether ISIS is more brutal, ISIS is worse than Al-Qaeda. I think it's irrelevant. I mean, ISIS is an upgrade. It's Al-Qaeda plus. And they just, we cannot write off ISIS simply sometimes as a crazy ragtag bunch of lunatics, which of course they are, but they are very smart and they are very effective, and they have done so by building and maintaining and consolidating the concept of a state, which Al-Qaeda and the franchises of Al-Qaeda did not do. And obviously it is tapping into specific Iraqi, Syrian grievances and regional grievances, and we cannot underestimate that. And there has been failings across the board, and of course bombing alone will not work. There has to be a coalition, an inclusive, inclusive group of regional and international powers, which includes Turkey, which includes Iran.
Joseph, I agree with you, but they're same partners. The Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia. I mean, where's the funding coming from here? I mean, again, they talk out of both sides of their mouth. They're afraid of these fundamentalist groups, but there are plenty of people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries that are just giving money to these people, and who knows what else here. I mean, a coalition is nice and fine, but can you trust your coalition partners? Go ahead, Joseph, before we go to the break.
Well, regardless of that, there has to be this inclusive approach, and this includes Russia and Iran, who of course have been funding Assad, and there are, we have to make sure there is this inclusive approach, because all parties do have a role to play, regardless of the implications. And without that, there will be no hope of freeing up Syria and Iraq of its tyrants of various forms.
Okay, Jabbar, in London, do you think this is what ISIS counts on, is that there's the relationships and alliances in the region are so complicated and contradictory even, that it's going to be very difficult for the region to deal with them?
Well, in a way, yes. They are more sophisticated than we think. They are not just, a bandit that decided to attack people and kill for nothing. They calculated everything, and they mobilized and invested in that area that there are conflicts, and many partners are not meeting in interest, are influencing the situation, especially in Syria. While in Iraq is different, of course. There's a government which at least been elected and replaced a brutal regime of Saddam. But in Syria, definitely they played it in a very clever way. But at the end of the day, this conflict can come to a halt.
Okay, on this note, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the Islamic State. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the threat known as the Islamic State. Okay, Ray, I'd like to go back to you in Washington. Exactly 1 year ago, there was the big discussion about the gas attacks in and around Damascus, and whether the U.S. was going to attack. And that was 1 year ago. I think there are plenty of people in Washington who would like another shot, another pretext to take out that regime, and actually try to use it to their advantage when dealing with ISIS. What do you think about that?
I don't think right now that the United States government wants to get rid of the Assad regime. I mean, who's going to replace it? We've seen in the last year all the things that have happened when, we've tried to do whatever in Syria. You have Assad. He's obviously a bad actor. We would like to not have him there. You have ISIS, which is, I think, even worse. You ostensibly have the Free Syrian Army, but no one really knows how powerful they are. Then you have other Islamist groups that are probably between Assad and ISIS in terms of ideology. So if you pull out Assad, what's going to happen? I don't think this government wants to do anything to help Assad, but I don't think that they can look at a future without him in power and realize that it's going to be any better. This is going to take years if you want to support the Free Syrian Army and hope they build up a kind of capacity, to replace Assad. That might be an option, but a vacuum that would be created by knocking out the Assad regime right now, I think, would be a disaster.
Okay, Joseph, a lot of neocons in Washington have not been as logical thinking. They would still take the advantage of the situation. Let's talk about Iran, because Iran is a very important regional player, and it's a very stable one at that. Again, odd bedfellows, because if you look at the Sunni-Shia divide, I mean, you see how the Iranians are helping out Baghdad. And again, one of these unintended consequences of the invasion of 2003. Again, because of the animosity between the West and Iran, that kind of cooperation is going to be quite limited. But if it could, we could get rid of some history and some bad feelings, Iran could play a very positive role in dealing with ISIS, because they have nothing in common with them.
Of course, I mean, ISIS are of course a threat to Iran, and they're very close to Iranian borders. And I think we've discussed before in the sense that actually, Iran's involvement with the US in terms of ISIS in Iraq was quite significant in terms of actually sometimes the people that the US are backing in Syria are are fighting against Assad, who's obviously being funded in Iran. And I think Iran has to be brought to the table. Iran is part of this inclusive approach towards Syria and Iraq. And of course, you've seen Iran's moves in Iraq. Maliki was a person that was supported by Iran and also largely got rid of by Iran. And I think that is significant. And obviously there are plenty of areas of agreement, even if not in public, where the US, the UK, and Iran can engage and can work, because obviously the threat is to plenty of us, whether we be in London, New York, Washington, Baghdad, Damascus, or Tehran.
Ray, if I can go quickly back to you in Washington, again, there's no political will for that, because logically speaking, if this is the greatest threat to the world right now, then you have to, forgive a few things and forget a few things, and you have to deal with people that you don't like with. And Iran's one of them. Again, this is an opportunity, but because of Israel and other lobbies, it's not going to happen, while the greatest threat in the world continues to scare everybody.
Well, I don't think we can say it's not going to happen. It could be happening right now, and we just don't know about it. Well, after all, we're talking to Iran about its nuclear program. We're doing that openly. I mean, when you're talking to people, you don't have to stick to the script about, oh, we're only going to talk about the nuclear program. You could go off into a corner and say, what are we going to do about ISIS? I mean, it's clearly in our interests. And obviously, if the Iranians help with ISIS, we may consider giving them a break somehow in the nuclear program. That's everything, goes into somebody's calculations when you're having a negotiation. Hey, if I give up this, maybe I'll get that. And so it would not surprise me at all if there are people who are having those conversations right now, but they're not making them public.
Okay, Jabara, in London, one of the things I find quite remarkable, particularly in the last 10 years, is that we just go from one war, one conflict, one sectarian conflict, one after another. It's almost if it's preordained. It just keeps the region boiling until you can get the right outcome you want. Because we all agree on this program, you're helping some people that are the enemies of some, and then the opposite. And you actually have these very strange bedfellows. Is this part of the calculation in the West, particularly Washington, to see where ISIS is going to go before you make your final bets and who you're going to back in the region?
Well, it's a very puzzling question. They had this problem in Afghanistan when they supported the Mujahideen, and Al-Qaeda came out of it.
Exactly.
And we all know what Al-Qaeda created. And again now, this ISIS or Islamic State came out of the Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is fading away. It's more extreme. They are occupying land and attracting so-called international Islamic terrorists into the region. It is, to us as Iraqis, we saw that the Americans and their allies, the British as well, they had no war removing Saddam's from power strategy, and they've always making errors here or there. It looks like it's a try and error, and on the expenses of the people of the region. ISIS should be dealt with immediately, and they should be stopped militarily, but that will not eradicate them. Definitely, it's a long process. If they really want to eradicate them, they have to cut off supplies. That's not only the money, but the pouring of international terrorists coming from all over the world, even from China and the Chechens and from the Balkans, from Europe. These are all using the route of, most of them are using the route of Turkey. This can be halted again. Going back to American policy, well, I am one of millions of Iraqis. We don't know what they are planning for tomorrow even.
Okay, that is one of the most interesting things said on this program today, and I want to go to Joseph, because do they have any idea what they're doing? This is what I've been getting at for years right now. Do they actually have a plan? Because when we look at what's being said about a year ago about sarin gas in Syria, I mean, it was just a few seconds away from hitting the button until someone said, hey, this doesn't make any sense at all. And then everybody stood back and said, yeah, you're right. I mean, Joseph, do you have any confidence at all that the policymakers, particularly in Washington, have any idea what they're doing, or are they just winging it?
I think there is an immense feeling that actually that really they don't know what to do, and this is, you know, you've had also senior former military figures in the UK only the other day saying that there is no clear strategy. I think, again, there's this sort of hangover, certainly in the UK and in the US as well, of a hangover about intervention in Iraq. And that does dominate any sense of intervention in the region. And of course, last year in London, we had a parliamentary vote which David Cameron lost. I think this time, if there were to be a vote on intervention in Iraq, I don't know whether it would go through, but I think there would be more support for it. There are indications, certainly in the British public, that around 45% of people would support British airstrikes. Obviously, more would support US airstrikes on ISIS targets in Syria and Iraq. And this has significantly increased since the beheading of Foley, and of course this idea, the very real threat, bringing it closer to home with actually British extremists being involved in Syria and Iraq, and estimates of around 500. And I think this is motivating, whether it be public opinion, but also political opinion. But whether it is just reactionary in terms of responding to the hysteria that ISIS is creating, and obviously there is a justification to the hysteria, but if the reaction is also in part hysterical, then there are dangers in a strategy that is dominated by that.
Ray, you're in Washington, you're inside the Beltway there. I mean, how much is Obama under pressure to do something, as they always say? Something must be done. You know, he's got midterm elections coming up, and, you know, there's this, you know, that creeping feeling of mission creep here. He has to show that he's doing something as commander-in-chief because, well, let's face it, under his presidency, he doesn't have too many foreign policy successes, and he looks weak. Again, is he going to be doing something that may not necessarily be in the national interest, but to make a show for the elections are only a few weeks away?
Well, there's obviously the pressure from some people who want him to do something. I mean, primarily, those are the same people who supported the invasion of Iraq 11 years ago. And I think the verdict on that intervention is clear. I mean, most Americans consider that a mistake, even though they didn't like Saddam Hussein. You know, you talk people inside Washington, the elites, the political elites, they favor some kind of action because that's usually what they do. You look at poll numbers from, you know, polls taken throughout the country, overwhelmingly not in favor of intervention in Syria, don't want to send troops back to Iraq. Maybe airstrikes because they think airstrikes are relatively antiseptic, at least to the people in the airplanes, not on the ground. There's not an appetite in the United States for, you know, a long-term commitment of ground troops. They don't want to go back into Iraq. You know, yet they want Obama to do something. And I think in many cases, the best action is to not do anything specific.
Well, you know, but you know, but doesn't, you know, the people that want something done, they have to make ISIS look so bad, the baddest of the bad. That'll help justify some intervention because, like you said, there's no appetite for it.
Oh, obviously, yeah. Well, I mean, you have to make them look bad, and they're doing a great job themselves of making themselves look bad. I mean, obviously, when you have, you know, people there killed, it's kind of an abstraction. You take an American journalist who is there just doing his job, you take him out in the middle of the desert and you cut his head off, and on a video that you post online, that gets a lot of people's attention.
Okay, gentlemen, it gets a lot of attention. Yeah, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Washington, and thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules. I love you.